And even though they're diverse and disparate, I think one of them will. So, Joe, I'll do you $20 on that.
I'll take the bet as well, but as long as it's inflation indexed to the $20, because otherwise it won't be worth very much by October 15.
I don't actually think my bank account can handle any more bets. So. Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Jo Moyer. I'm back in Wellington with Mark Dalder. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Joe.
And in Auckland on his lonesome this time, Tim Murphy. Hi, Tim.
Hi, you too.
Today we're going to discuss new polls, what's been happening on the campaign trail, and then we'll dive into the latest with Winston Peters. And to wrap up, we'll offer you some recommendations. First up, a new poll, a campaign trail plagued by COVID, and a canned debate. Let's have a look at the poll first. Of course, TVNZ, the One News Varian poll came out on Wednesday night. They're now weekly polling. Nothing too much to see there though, Mark, was there?
No, I mean, in terms of movement, there wasn't any for any of the big parties except for ACT, which dropped 2 points to 10%. But Labour, National, the Greens, Te Pāti Māori, New Zealand First, all perfectly stagnant, I think was the word used, particularly in relation to Labour. Where that fits in with trends is that actually Labour and National have both been dropping a bit recently, so they seem to have stopped dropping. The Greens were rising, they seem to have stopped rising, and ACT is still dropping down a bit. New Zealand First kind of floating around that 5-6%.
The poll, though, seems to be showing that the centre-right is actually coming down, right, though? That vote on the right is getting slimmer.
That's right, because ACT dropped 2 points. And to be fair, that's kind of a pattern we've been seeing, that gap closing very, very slightly over recent polls, also with the Greens rising recently. So it's a continuation of a trend, but it's a very slow trend.
So what does that mean, Tim? I mean, advance voting started on Monday. The centre-left will look at that and they will see that the centre-right is coming down a little bit. And basically, they're going to be hopeful that they can get out and that sort of anywhere between 10 and 12% of undecided, they can still basically make them change their minds, right?
Yeah, but that would be a triumph of hope over experience, I think. That, at this point, there's not a whole lot that's going to move a whole lot of people from where they are now, I think. And that they're voting now. It'd be interesting if you could ever analyse the pattern of the vote day by day by party as opposed to the final result or the election day. I wouldn't think that people will be sort of holding out, a wild change to the patterns by it being a later vote for Labour and the Greens.
It was interesting because I just came from a stand-up with Grant Robertson and I basically said to him, how perplexing is it to you that the centre-right vote is now just over more recent polls increasingly giving Winston Peters and New Zealand First more leverage, and the fact that it seems as if there's this sort of mood for change. And even Chris Hipkins and Grant Robertson a couple of weeks ago, started saying, yes, there is a mood for change, but we need to convince people that change isn't a good thing. I mean, how perplexing is it that all the change is now looking like is a sort of beefed up Winston Peters and New Zealand First?
Well, New Zealand First ACT National ultimately, if that's, away from Labour and the Greens, and that still looks like it to be the most obvious. The breakdown of the seats from that Varian poll, Mark, would show that if he went with the other side, that Labour, Greens, Māori and New Zealand First could pull it together. But, of course, he's been very clear this time he won't do that with Labour because of whatever those slights and injustices and conspiracies were against him last time. So, I think, yes, New Zealand First boosted a bit, but it's still on 6. And it hasn't always gone up in campaigns, New Zealand First. It can fall a bit too. So I'm wondering, and I was going to put this out there for you guys, just a theory of another strand of strategic voting and the possibility of whether to save New Zealand First's 5% or to ensure it, whether some of the fringe parties, this is Liz Gunn's thing, Loyal and New Conservatives and New Zeal and Freedom and some of those others, whether they actually, seeing that they're getting, 4/5 of nothing themselves, think something they can do is to say to their voters, actually swing in behind Winston and give him one or two more. So there'd be a strategic voting, and that'd be a call that no doubt he wouldn't make. He'd have an underling do it because it's beneath him to talk to minor parties. But if 2 or 3 of them were able to get some of their voters to swing over as well, does that guarantee that for them?
I think if they did do it, that would certainly boost New Zealand First's chances, given how close it is to the threshold. But from looking at the way that these fringe parties have sort of developed and interacted over the past year and a bit, I think that's really unlikely. They keep coming together for these big summits to try and form an umbrella party, and invariably they all disagree because each of them wants to be the leader of the umbrella party. Sometimes more parties leave the summit than came to the summit. Leighton Baker has his own party just called the Leighton Baker Party. It's hard to imagine him going around and saying, actually, support Winston Peters. That's the Leighton Baker Party's, policy now.
That's getting into that time of year, Tim, where we put our money where our mouth is. So how much are you putting on this happening?
Oh, I'd bet you, Joe, $20 that one of those fringe parties breaks with the shortness of 8 days or so to go, Mark, focusing their mind, and 0.4% or something in the polls focusing their mind and thinking, well, here's a guy who might carry some of our policy or at least grievances into Parliament. Things can be very sort of traded away in principle and honour. And even though they're diverse and disparate, I think one of them will. So, Joe, I'll do you $20 on that.
I'll take the bet as well, but as long as it's inflation indexed to the $20, because otherwise it won't be worth very much by October 15.
I don't actually think my bank account can handle any more bets. So I think the big sort of thing that happened this week that has kind of changed things up significantly is, of course, Chris Hipkins in isolation. Still in isolation at time of recording and expected to be out on Friday morning. What has that done to the campaign trail for Labour, do you think, Mark?
I think it's obviously a blow that they are, not something that they wanted to afford or could afford. I think the biggest impact there is what happens with the press debate in particular. Labour was quite clear about how their goal over the last few weeks of the campaign was to really get these key media moments, and that was the debates, that was, anything where there are a lot of cameras. The day-to-day campaign stops and stuff, you got to keep doing it, but they didn't think that's going to be the thing that turns the campaign around. It's really whacking Luxon in a debate, and having one fewer opportunity to do that, particularly after he did so well, Hipkins, at the News Hub debate, and with the last chance being on the Thursday, 2 days before the election, when significant numbers of people will already have voted. I think that's really, really difficult for them.
I have found it kind of comical that obviously they're trying to keep Chris Hipkins on the 6 p.m. news and, photographs, etc. So they've set up this kind of 2 p.m. press conference that he's doing with the press gallery, which is a Zoom call. I mean, he genuinely looks a little bit like he's in a hostage video, with a half-decent suit and a tie on, which makes it even more kind of confusing to the eye. But, they're kind of trying to do everything they can. He did a town hall meeting on Wednesday night. He's done a kids' town hall meeting on Thursday. I'm not entirely sure why, because it's not as if they can vote. It seemed like a bit of a weird choice. What have you made of it, Tim? What sort of an impact do you think it's had in terms of, I guess, looking at it from the other side? Has National been able to really maximise on it?
Joe, I don't think they really have maximised on it. I thought it was a bit shabby, the comment from Luxon that being diagnosed positive for COVID was the only positive thing that Chris Hipkins has done, in government and so on. But other than that, they haven't really made much ground themselves. Part of that's been because they've had their own issues over Winston Peters and New Zealand First and over, accusations over that debate and so on. I think Labour's actually shown some innovation and really tried hard to get him back in, as you say, the 6 o'clock newses, online and advertising messaging and so on. I think the poor guys looked pretty crook He's been very red-eyed, and as you say, Joe, it looks like he's been held up by someone from behind, if they're allowed to get close to him, to try and keep him vertical. And it's look, it sucked the life out of Labor's campaign. There's just so much less attention that they have got, no matter what they've done, and no matter what Carmel Sepuloni and Grant Robertson and Kira McAnulty and the others have tried, and I take my hat off to them. I think they just have had to be sort of innovative and tried really hard. But for the whole campaign, it's taken the wind out of where they would have wanted to be. The debate, Mark, as you say, but in general. You'd wonder whether for Hipkins in his quiet moments in his hotel room, he'd be sort of thinking, what's going to be worse, isolation here or opposition?
Yeah, well, I mean, he'd also kind of just announced before he tested positive that, he was going to go sort of really full on, and this was the new momentum and the new high energy, and within about 48 hours he was isolating and sick as a dog. So that didn't actually last that long, and he did really seem as if he had kind of rallied, and people had had a stern word with him, and he'd kind of got a kick up the backside to get going, and that's just completely taken the wind out of all of that. The press debate has been an interesting point. I mean, Christopher Luxon has obviously taken the opportunity to not have to do it. Why do something that you might risk losing when Chris Hipkins is the one who has technically pulled out here. He is the one who could not make it on Tuesday this week. So as much as people are saying that Luxon's been unreasonable for not finding an alternative date, he didn't have to, and why would you if you are going to run the risk that, that Chris Hipkins does what he did at the News Hub debate, which comes out firing. I think that press debate and a live audience of sort of 2,000 people would have been kinder to Chris Hipkins potentially, just because I think he's better in that sort of lively audience. He's a bit more agile. I think he probably would have done a little bit better. So not surprised at all that Luxon has gone, you know what, let's just leave it until that final TVNZ debate next week and take it from there.
Yeah, look, I think that this has been probably the low point of the politicking and the party's behaviour and conduct through this whole campaign. Megan Woods and what she was alleging, the chicken thing from Aisha Verrill, but also, Chris Bishop's response and the taunting and the goading and the willful kind of misrepresentation of each other and so on. Bottom line, totally agree with you, Joe. There was another debate coming. This one couldn't be done, and everyone accepted it couldn't be done. All the other options were lesser things, and it was a bit whiny, I think, of some people down in Christchurch to be so sort of offended by it all. Really, these things happen. It's fate. Move on.
There goes our South Island audience.
And possibly Sam Suchdever will never come back. Now, let's chat about old mate Winston Peters, that interview, and what exactly is eating Chris Bishop. Jack Tame did a extraordinary and very good interview on Sunday with Winston Peters. Tim, you were watching. What did you make of Winston Peters' performance in that particular interview?
I thought the second half, in which he abused and kind of vaguely threatened and the stuff that made all the news, was, poor and, shabby as well. But I thought the more interesting thing to me was the first half, when he just could not answer really straight questions on New Zealand First policies and costings. And it looked to me like in his mind, and as you looked at him, in his eyes, there was sort of a twitch, and he was trying to think as he was asked these questions, how do I get through not answering this? How can I divert on this? It was almost like those movie scenes you see where one jet's chasing the other and about to fire on the other, and the one in front throws out heat flares out the back to try and divert the missile. And there were just like a rain of heat flares coming out from Peters, but Jack's missiles didn't move and they kept coming. I really thought that was more telling to me about Peters' performance, was a series of simple questions where he just would not or could not answer. People have said, this interview was like Muldoon and abusive and taking on the journalist and abrasive, and that's great. But Muldoon used to be absolutely full of numbers, figures, policies. He wouldn't be beaten by many people on knowing his own policy package. And I was abused early on in my career by Muldoon, so I know it. But he knew his stuff. And Peters in this one, possibly the worst interview on that basis that I've seen him give over a long time of watching.
Yeah, and it seemed kind of strange to me because Jack Tame's been doing a series of leaders' interviews, and every single one, there has been a bit of a formula to it, and it has been very much about sort of picking a handful of policies, working out exactly what the costings are, the criticisms that have been made of those policies, what the person that he's interviewing's response is. Like, it's very formulaic. And how Winston Peters went into that interview and didn't seem to have simple answers like how much something will cost or how many people it would be, would be impacted by it. It was as if like nobody had done their homework at all, which, you know what, when you've been in politics as long as he has, and he's actually got a half decent team kind of running things around him this year, for none of them to have actually given him some solid costings and some solid numbers is just actually kind of really lazy on their part, I thought. And it also raises this question of where the hell is New Zealand First's manifesto?
Hey, producer Hugo jumping in here because right on cue, New Zealand First have released their manifesto. It arrived on the evening of Thursday, October 5th after our recording session and about 10 minutes before Winston was due on television for the multi-party debate. Back to the show.
He said on Sunday in that Q&A interview it was coming out. He said in a stand-up later that day at the groundswell protest that it was coming out. He said to me this week it was coming out on a particular day, and here we are and it still hasn't. I mean, at this point in the election cycle, Mark, what does that say to voters too when they haven't even got their manifesto together?
Well, I guess there's a question as to how many people are voting for New Zealand First based on the particulars of their policies as opposed to a range of other things around ideology, politics, the strategic stuff of going, I like National, but I don't want ACT to have all the power, or I want a slightly different version of National, and Winston can help kind of move them in that direction, or just I really like Winston Peters. I think he's, the real deal, as it were. So I think, for other parties that might be more damaging than it is for New Zealand First. But again, I think we've also seen this election that you can have a lot of issues with your policy or a lot of controversy around it and still kind of get away unscathed. And so maybe it's just a signal that in general, voters are less concerned about policy this time, and it really is, like we were saying, that thing about wanting a change.
I mean, Winston Peters remains sort of the only kind of talking point in town. Obviously, last week on Raw Politics, we were talking about Chris Luxon ruling him in, and Tim, you went along to a David Seymour press conference earlier in the week where, he's put out his own video as well now, not actually naming New Zealand First though, but pretty much talking about him, right?
Yeah, didn't mention Peters or New Zealand First in the stand-up that I was at, which was about that video release, but was just constantly saying you can have ACT and National, or you can have chaos. You can have ACT, National, or you can have chaos, and said it repeatedly. And that's fair. He is probably in direct competition for some votes that are making up 0.5% or 1% here and there for those two parties. But he also doesn't want a life, I guess, where someone he can't bear, whose policies he doesn't stand for, is going to be there with as much, possibly almost as much influence as he does. Look, Mark, I think your point about New Zealand First's policies and details maybe not mattering so much to the voters is probably right. That, Peters doesn't deal in that kind of detail because that's not his style. And so broad brush, a promise to sort out the other side and them and they and all that. And people are sort of going, okay, yeah, that's all right, that's good. He'll do it without probably needing it. So he doesn't get it. He's happy for Shane to have written it down on the back of a napkin at a dinner. And that's the manifesto at the moment, Joe. So I think the manifesto, when it comes, might not look like most manifestos. It might not have as much volume, might not have as much detail and numbers, Mark. And
it'll be handwritten and with a few extra grease stains than the normal one.
Yeah, and it'll also say we can't give any more detail until we're in government because we get the information. So there's always going to be those sort of, caveats and so on. But look, the other thing this week that I think, Joe, that we should get into is this campaign strategy for National and the campaign team and leadership. I thought in 2020, when Jerry Brownlee was in charge for Judith Collins of the campaign, that it went particularly poorly. Before that, they had, was it Paula Bennett, I think, in 2017 for English. And then before that, I think Joyce might have done them. And they were, they had their hiccups here and there. But this one just seems to have had some miscues strategically and tactically. And it's also had some of the same misbehaviour as Jerry exhibited last time, just getting a little bit sort of into the weeds and reactive and a bit intolerant maybe of the voters not seeing them and not giving their appreciation yet. So I think Chris Bishop and whomever else is on that committee probably needs to take a step back.
Yeah, I feel like it's been quite an unprecedented number of times that we have seen either Chris Bishop, Nicola Willis or Grant Robertson or Megan Woods kind of coming out and having a massive attack at the other side or responding to some other sort of attack line. I mean, the black and white tiles are normally empty during the campaigning period here in Wellington, but they are, got a lot of shoe walking marks on them at the moment because people are just rolling out every day to have a crack at the other side. And, Chris Bishop's been an interesting one in all of this. And it begs the question, really, how much is New Zealand First really factoring in their internal polling at the moment? And how much is that kind of giving National and the people who are kind of running the campaign, which of course is Chris Bishop, it is Nicola Willis and it is Christopher Luxon, the heebie-jeebies going, oh my goodness, how much leverage is this guy going to have? And that's kind of playing out, I think, a little bit in their behaviour. I mean, we saw a press conference from Chris Bishop this week, which was kind of borderline unhinged behaviour from him. He completely lost it. I mean, you could basically see the steam coming out of his ears. He was sort of shouting at everyone about everything. And you kind of go, well, what could be bringing that on when you've got polls showing and have been showing for some time now that it's likely to be a centre-right government? The only thing that could be bringing on that kind of behaviour and response is if they've got internals that are showing New Zealand First just continuing to increase and continuing to rise. And Tim, I'm interested in your thoughts on this one. How much do you think actually Chris Luxon basically doing that video a week ago and, saying he'd pick up the phone and ruling in Winston Peters has actually caused this? Because I maintain that they should have just said nothing, because all they've done is breathed oxygen into New Zealand First and Winston Peters, and it's all anyone's been talking about for a week now.
Well, I think you need to look to yourself as the press gallery because you didn't get what they were trying to say. The gallery is apparently within National being sort of lined up as having not got the message and willfully not understood what Luxon was trying to say on that thing. That, when he was saying, I would if I have to pick up the phone, that was meant to be read negatively. But too much of the media coverage was, he would pick up the phone and didn't make enough of the condition. That's why we saw him go, it's the last resort and I don't really want to do it. And I don't want to work with this man who I don't know and all those things. So there was a little bit of this attitude that they thought they'd done a good video and a good message that was going to do the sort of thing that John Key has come out on Thursday doing for them, which is much more heavily saying you need to only vote one way and we don't want the distraction and the compromise. And it's, again, not mentioning New Zealand First. But so I think, I think too, Joe, that it should have been left alone. And it'd be really interesting to read the history of this campaign and a book in a few years where someone reveals as a fly on the wall who said what to whom in that strategy meeting that they had, how much of it was a captain's call by Luxon, how much was from people like Bishop, from pollsters, and so on, because it just seems to have been a miscue and they will regret it, I think. And that's on them, not on anyone else.
Yeah, I think the biggest missed opportunity was just in not ruling Winston out months and months ago when he was polling very consistently below 5%, doing the Simon Bridges thing, which I don't remember exactly when it was that Simon Bridges ruled out working with New Zealand First, but it was when he was still leader, right? So before May 2020, 5 months ahead of the election, by leaving it open, that meant New Zealand First got the time to rise in the polls, and then it suddenly became a possibility that they would be in Parliament, that National would be reliant on them. And so it's too late to rule them out. You can either do what Joe is suggesting and ignore it, or you can say, National's trying to say, we don't want to do it, but we will as a last resort. But the only thing that's different there from what they'd been saying previously is we will do it if we have to. Before, they just wouldn't talk about it. And so that's what the news is, of course. Whatever they want to say about their framing, sure. But if you get down to the substance of what was said was there are two worlds, one in which National doesn't govern because we don't want to work with Winston Peters, or one in which we do govern because we do want to work with Winston Peters. And the latter is the one that we've chosen.
Can I just save myself here, by the way, and say that a week before Christopher Luxon put that video out, I did write a piece saying he has already answered the question. His language had significantly changed in sort of the 10-day period before that, and he was making it pretty clear to the media to translate to the public that he would pick up the phone if he had to without saying it as specifically and transparently as he ended up doing in that video. I felt a sense of satisfaction when he came out and did that video, having already written the piece. But it was strange to me that nobody else had picked up. I mean, it's our job to pick up on the nuances and the changes of language, and he had very much changed his language about Winston Peters. But you're right, Tim, in every stand-up, he was still getting, anywhere between 8 and 18 questions of, are you ruling him in or out? Are you ruling him in or out? And I guess, the media as a whole is, takes a bit of responsibility for that one then.
So I don't mean the media should take any responsibility at all. That was said in the voice of, National feeling affronted. I don't think the media should take anything. They said it. They said it that way, Mark, as you said. It could only be one thing or the other. And it led to this. And now that it didn't go down very well, the sort of retrospective view is that, people receiving it weren't hearing it the right way, which is a pretty strange way to critique communications.
And I just wanted to add, from the campaign trail, being with Christopher Luxon on Wednesday on the West Coast, 3 separate times to 3 separate audiences, he made the point saying this election is really close. And yes, when you're ahead in the polls, you don't tend to brag about it, Jacinda Ardern didn't in 2020. But she didn't talk about it being, particularly tight either. She just said, let's wait until the election. The closeness here is not between Labour and National, at least on the current polls, but it's really that thing of he's clearly worried about having to work with New Zealand First and is trying to get out the vote as much as he can from National voters who might be feeling maybe less pressure to get out and vote because they feel like it's pretty likely that National is going to be in government, but he wants more National votes specifically so that he doesn't have to work with Winston Peters.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you've watched, read or listened to this week that you have enjoyed. Mark, let's start with you.
I really enjoyed Tim Murphy's performance review of Christopher Luxon on Newsroom. Just a funny way to actually take stock of what's happened since Chris Luxon became the leader of the National Party and how the campaign has gone. I slightly disagree with your evaluation, Tim, that he's, achieved the KPI of getting across the detail. I think there's still things he gets flubbed by and flubs on pretty regularly, but that's okay. There are always different views within the HR department.
I'm not sure I said detail, Mark. I was quite careful to leave that word out.
Okay.
I feel like everyone's getting a performance review today. So, Tim, who are you recommending?
Look, I was impressed with some work that Annika Smith did on RNZ after hearing our friend Winston Peters talk about climate and climate change and some facts and figures he was throwing out. It was rare that he came out with facts and figures, but these ones weren't facts and they were figures. And she's gone to some experts and said, well, how does that show in reality? And they're just figures that are imaginary.
Totally agree. It was a really good piece by Annika. And my recommendation this week is what we've already talked about. Jack Tame, the Q&A presenter, his interview with Winston Peters at the weekend. Really, really good watch. Highly recommend. Go back and have a look. And that's it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our producer Hugo Stewart and our readers, listeners and viewers. Please send any burning questions you have to me, joe.moyer@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.